and off we go. Welcome to day 2 of getting started with web automation. I'm Jim Holmes. I'm the evangelist for Test Studio at Telerik. You can see my contact information up there. Please do feel free to drop me a mail if you'd like. The bit.ly link at the bottom there is for the my blog at Telerik, where I talk a lot about Test Studio and other factors. So today you are going to be joining us for the second day, which is really kind of learning the next steps about web automation. Throughout the day, please feel free, throughout this session, please feel free to ask questions. You can use the GoToMeeting Q&A panel down there. There are a large number of you. There's only one of me. I'll try to juggle things as best I can. And I'll also leave some time at the end for questions and answers as well. So the goals of this webinar, yesterday we talked about fundamentals, and that was really around locators and understanding kind of how the page loads on web pages, what the document object model is. Today's going to be focusing on next steps. We'll be working with dynamic content, learning how to deal with wait situations. This is probably the second most critical set of concepts that you'll need for having successful web automation. And then tomorrow, we'll be doing some things that will help you understand strategies for making sure you've got long-term success. So the format of these sessions, this is a 3-day series. The content today will run 30 to 45 minutes. I'm happy to take questions as we go. I'll also leave some time at the end. I am recording these sessions, and they will be uploaded to tv.telerik.com. It does take a little bit of time. I've got a number of moving parts to get those things processed and up. So let me give a quick recap of what we covered yesterday. In case you weren't here, that'll be fine. Nothing is, you'll be able to catch it up on the webinar. Pardon me, on the recording. So talked a bit about what automation is for, where you should use it, the sorts of things that you should look to automate, and just as importantly, the sorts of things you should avoid automating. That's a very critical concept to understand. Not everything is there to be automated. Not everything's useful. We covered how automation works. You have a test script that you write in something like Selenium WebDriver or Water, or that you have written in Test Studio. A test runner kicks that process off. It starts up the browser, it attaches a plugin to the browser, and then we're able to communicate directly to the browser. We talked about the web page loading process and how a server will give back pieces of information to a browser, which is the client. That client then reassembles everything, renders it, and builds the entire page into what's called the document object model, or DOM. And we need to care about that because the DOM is crucial to being able to understanding the DOM is crucial to building stable tests and understanding how to create locators that help you find things within the DOM to inject text to or to verify, those sorts of things. So that was day 1. Today we'll be working with dynamic content. AJAX is the example I'll be using, but the idea is exactly the same if you're working with Silverlight and you have server-side calls. There are a number of other technologies. The idea is that your page is loaded. There's some sorts of processing that's going on that's altering content on that page without reloading the entire page. And in these situations, we have to help the browser and our test script understand when it needs to delay. We'll be talking about tables, which seem simple but can give us quite a bit of grief when we're trying to write stable, robust tests. We'll also talk about reusing test functionality. So again, 30, probably closer to 45 minutes of content. If you join us tomorrow, we'll start talking about some really critical concepts of teardown and setup steps, how to deal with data driving multiple parameters or values through a test, baseline data sets, and then also some discussion about where you want to put your tests in source control, because this can be really crucial and varies in your environment. All right, so let's back up one slide and we'll get rolling with what we're talking about today. AJAX, tables, robust tests, and reusing test functionality. So first off, let me pop over to one of my sample machines that I have here. Alright, so in this VM that I'm running here, I have a demo project already loaded up, and here's the demonstration that we're going to be working with. So if you're familiar with the AJAX control toolkit from Microsoft, there's actually a great demo site here under ASP.NET AJAX library control toolkit sample. You can navigate to that. I'll also make these samples available at my blog. And we're going to start looking at how we have to deal with those dynamic content situations. So we saw the page loaded, but now we've got some interesting menus here. So I've got a make, model, and color. I'm going to build a car here. And as I select a make, the next item will populate. And if you were watching closely, you might have seen a little delay there that said loading. And here we'll see it again, although that one worked very quickly. So there are tiny delays as I make each choice, and that is because I make a choice and the system actually has to reach back from my browser back to the server, get some more information, and bring that back. And it didn't reload the whole page. If you remember from yesterday's discussions, when we're loading a page, say we navigate to a site, the document object model, the DOM, has a flag set on it that says, this page is loading, it's not ready yet. And our test tools understand that when that flag is set, that the page isn't ready, we have to delay. And the frameworks and the tools handle that for us. Selenium, Water, QTP, Test Studio, whichever tool. This is standard behavior from any test framework or tool set that's worth its weight. However, in these AJAX type of situations, we don't reload the entire page. Instead, what we do is we only load part of the page and refresh a little bit of it. So let's wait for that page to reload. You'll notice that there was some gray area here that said loading, even for this first make. Let's take a look at what the actual DOM looks like. So I'm back in Firebug, and I'm going to do some exploration here. And we can see that this control is a simple select box with some options that are populated. But if we take a look at the next option down for model, we'll see that we've got our select here, but we only have one option, and that one is populated with some watermark text. This actually doesn't populate until I come back here, select something up there, we'll update and refresh things here. And I actually have to reload this because it doesn't capture. So I'm going to reload the page here and do this once more so we can see what that'll look like now. So select Acura. We'll select RL. And now when I come down to model, now we've got the options populated. So we have the elements there. The select menu is on the page. It's got an option element populated. How do we know to have the script pause and wait for that? If you're not familiar with this and you haven't ever done this sort of thing before, then you may do something like a simple test record, and we'll show how this looks and how it will actually not work for us. So let's go ahead and record a test here. And I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to grab the URL for this page. We're going to just record a simple test here. So we're navigating there. Things load up. We'll make some selections. Here's the model. Here's the color. And now let's just do a quick verification on our confirmation message here. Alright, so I've got the test recorded. I navigate to the location, I do my selections, and then I do a quick verification on the text. So let's play it back and we'll see what happens here. So remember, I'm actually going out to the live site, so there's some network latencies. The server out there may be a little overloaded. And we'll see that it didn't even get to the first step. If I pop this open, we couldn't find any of the values here. So we were expecting that we'd have some populated values. Instead, we got nothing, because if we take a close look here, we can see that we're still loading and we've got no content there. So how do we deal with these situations? This is a problem where the test script is playing things back so quickly that it doesn't know it needs to wait until that menu loads up. So let's take a look at how we can actually record this in a much more stable fashion and build up a solid, reliable test. The pattern that we're going to want to do here is whenever we want to interact with something in this situation, we're going to wait for it to appear first. So I'm reloading the page here and I'll show you what we'll do. So we're going to wait for this to be active and populated with our information here. We'll make a choice. We'll wait for this to be populated and we'll make a choice. And that's the same pattern that we're going to follow through this entire bit here. So we'll record another test. Now, while this is loading and connecting, let me point out that I'm showing this in a cascading menu. But the idea and the concept is exactly the same regardless of whether you're waiting for menus to get populated, regardless of whether you're waiting on the server to send you back a table to populate with data, or certain pieces and parts of your UI to activate. Another example might be a workflow system where you have a screen that has several tabs on it, and you work across those tabs filling out information and doing something like clicking next. So you'd fill out everything on your first step, you click next, and there's a little server callback or there's some processing on the page, and you have to wait for that until the second tab appears or is activated. So in this case, you're waiting on the second tab to become active. That's the condition you'd wait on. Alright, so I've got this here. We'll go ahead and navigate back to our drop-down. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is set up a wait on this make for that to be loaded. And this is a two-step process in Test Studio. I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to pull up our Elements menu, and I'm going to build a verification here. Actually, I can do it this way. I'm going to do a quick task. No, I don't want to do that. I want to do a verification. I'm going to verify on the content, and then notice here that I've already got the particular makes listed there. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to select Content Verify. Exact text is there. That validates. I'm going to take that validation, and now I go back to Test Studio, and I change this role to await. So this is an explicit wait now. I'm explicitly saying here is the exact condition that you need to wait for. If you're working with WebDriver, this is actually pretty much exactly the same here. So the idea is that, and this is actually a test in Selenium WebDriver for the same exact page. So I've got some helper methods that I've written here. And so we need to wait for the make option to populate, and then we'll select something. And with Selenium, you set up an explicit wait through the WebDriver wait. And then once that's configured, then we give the exact case that we're looking for. And in this case, we're defining please wait until this web element, which is that drop-down list, contains the make. So I've got this a somewhat more dynamic, helper method here. In this case, I'm passing in the particular make. It'd be Audi. So the point is, wait until this element, drop-down list, contains Audi somewhere, and then you're okay. Now let me bounce back here, and let's talk for a quick moment about how waits work. So the idea is that we need to delay on this page until that loads. We're not putting in a manual pause. We are definitely not doing that. We're not saying stop here and wait for 10 seconds and then move on. A wait is extremely dynamic. It's a little poll loop. We have a timeout period for this loop, and by default, that timeout is 10 seconds. I could adjust it specifically for this step here if I needed to, but the idea is that for 10 seconds, we're going to pause at this step, and we're going to wait for whatever condition it is we've defined here, and we'll check every half second or so until that condition is met or until the timeout period hits. So we hit the step. The first half second, the condition isn't ready, the text isn't there, we'll wait, we'll sleep for another half second, we'll check the page again to see if the condition's there, we'll keep doing that. And let's say that finally after 4.5 seconds the text appears, we'll stop waiting and we'll continue on because the condition's been met. Now if that condition isn't met, if that text doesn't show back up until say 11 seconds, we'll actually fail because we'll have hit the timeout. So we'll keep going. 9 seconds, not there. 9.5 seconds, still not there. 10 seconds, not there. The test step will fail. Putting in a 10-second wait in this fashion does not mean you're going to always wait for 10 seconds. You wait until the condition's met, and then you move on. Alright, so we have done our first wait. We're going to select something now. We'll select Acura. Now we need to wait for the model list to load. The model list is finally loaded here. We'll do the same thing. Build a verification. Check the content. Make sure that it looks like this. Come back to Test Studio. Change that to await. Back on the screen for recording, make a choice. Wait for the color to show up. Change that to await. And I goofed and hit the key while we were recording, so I'll get rid of that. We'll make our choice here. And now we'll do one last wait, which is this validation message here. So I'm done recording. I need to change this last verify to await. And I don't need to add any other validations here. The simple act of me waiting for that text to appear means that A, that the correct exact text that I'm expecting appears, or B, it didn't appear and it was wrong, or C, it never appeared because we have a broken service call or something's wrong with the system. So in any of those cases, it proves the test works as expected. The text either appears and the test passes, or it fails because we get the wrong text and we hit the timeout, or it fails because the text never comes back and we hit the timeout and things fail. Now, if the demo gods are favoring me, we'll run this in Chrome and we'll see it pass. And while this is running, I'm going to get a quick drink. Okay, so there we go. This is a crucial concept that you need to understand because this is a common pattern with any similar situation. Something's happening on your page, content, controls, whatever, doesn't get activated or doesn't get brought onto the page until something else happens on the page. And you're not reloading the entire page. So you have to understand this pattern of, I'm doing something, I need to wait until that appears. So this would be one example of that. Another example could even be something like hitting google.com. So if I use the word wheel search on Google, and you have to forgive me, my internet connection's a little slow because I'm doing a broadcast and hitting Google at the same time. So if I do something like type my list narrows as things are changing. So you saw that things are halting here. If I change the scope, then we see different return sets appear. So if I was looking for functional testing, and my test case was to ensure that this Wikipedia entry showed up, I would need to make sure to wait for that first before I validated it and perhaps tried to move on by navigating through it. All right. So there was a question about how we changed steps to wait. I'm sorry, I do this on a very regular basis, and I probably blew through that too quickly. I can right-click on any verification, or actually any step, and I can change its role. So change role, I can set as verification, I can set as extraction. If it's a verification step, then I can change that to await. Okay, so this is an example of an explicit wait. We are explicitly waiting for conditions to happen. This is necessary when you are trying to deal with content getting loaded into elements that are already on the page. So if you remember, we had the select control and its options on the DOM here. So let me bounce. Oh, we're right there already. How handy. So we already had an option populated here. Even further on down, the empty select lists actually had an option with the watermark of please select a model. So this is explicit because we're dealing with adding in more of the same types of elements, or we're adding in content to those elements. There's also a case where we are adding on entirely new elements to the page DOM. So if I come back here, get rid of my VMware tab there, and I take a look at this menu, at this element here, we can see that I've got a div and I've got a span, and there's nothing underneath that span. But if I pull down and select something here, we see that we get a new element in the DOM. So we got back some text you selected, but we also got back an entirely new element populated into the DOM. Now, in these cases, Test Studio will actually handle things for you via an implicit wait. If there is a new element that you have to interact with that wasn't there before, we can handle that wait condition for you. So let me show you how we do that. This is very easy, and it's a straight record here. Let me get rid of yesterday's example. So add a new test. And let's go ahead and record this. Well, that's starting up. Let me get the URL. Most popular testing tools and testing frameworks support these same two metaphors of implicit and explicit weights. We can do the same thing in Selenium WebDriver, and Water also has the same type of approach there. All right, so here we go. We're going to go back to the drop-down menu. I'm going to select something here, and I'll select dry fruit this time. I'm going to verify that that element is now there, and I'm just going to verify that the text is there. However, it will be verifying on this specific element. That's how I set that up. Now, I can run this test back, and I've not had to do any explicit weights. Now I'll just run this back, and we'll see that even with that server call, the test will still pass. There's a delay. We're waiting. It appears. We do the verification. We move on. So these are two dynamic content situations in this context through AJAX, but explicit is when you need to deal with new content that's getting loaded into existing elements. Implicit weight we can help you out with by detecting when new elements that you need to interact with on the page appear. Now, I'll also say that in a number of automated testing circles, some of the people that work extensively with Selenium and with some of the other tools, they're not the biggest fans of implicit weights because, in a way, we're actually masking some of the complexity for you. When you look at this tool, at this test, you don't right off the top of your head understand that we're dealing with a dynamic callback situation there. There's pros and cons to either approach. If you are someone who wants to be more explicit in your tests, you can certainly do this. I could change this to a weight here, and now it would be an explicit weight. That would also, by the way, do that same verification step. You could also just rely on us to handle that for you. I think in these particular cases, what matters is what are you comfortable with, what works reliably in your environment. And this is something where it's not evil to have the implicit weights handle things, but I think it's worth you taking some time on your own to determine what works best in your own environment. All right, so there we have some coverage of the main sorts of dynamic content situations. The key takeaway is when you have a dynamic callback on your page, again, it may be AJAX like I've shown here. It might be you're working with Silverlight and you are using service calls behind the scenes. Maybe you're doing something similar to AJAX in a regular web page, but it's a different way of dealing with that dynamic callback. The point is, you're not reloading the whole page. You're refreshing parts of the page or updating parts of the page before you interact with those new things that are appearing on the page. Make sure to wait for them first. This is by far the second biggest issue that I've seen time and time again with customers in my current role, with teams that I was coaching in my previous role, and with my own experience in any number of jobs before that. Tests would be running and failing intermittently. We'd move tests to a different environment where things ran faster or slower, and the tests would fail where they'd passed previously. So we'd start littering things in with manual pauses. If you are doing a manual delay or a manual pause, in 99.987% of the time, that's probably wrong. Instead, you should be looking for the condition that you need to move forward with the test and wait on that. All right, so I've kind of beaten this to death, but I'm doing that for a purpose. And the point is, The purpose is to try to help you make sure you aren't running into these same problems. Understand locators that we went over yesterday, understand dealing with dynamic content that we've gone over today, and you'll find your tests working much more stably and robustly. All right. So now let's take the next step, which is starting to deal with tables. Tables can be a little funky when you're working with tests. So let me pop open two different things here. Oh, and it appears, rather foolishly, I forgot to start my demo app before I got into this with you guys. So we'll give that a minute to start up. But I can talk about this table here. When I am recording tests and I'm doing something like adding new records to my database and I want to validate that those new records are showing up appropriately, by default, the most simplistic way that I record things will record things in a positional fashion. And what I mean by that is if I am verifying that I was able to create Jane Cobb in my system, and I selected this cell to verify contents, that this cell was Jane, that would, by default, say come to this table, come to the second row, and the third cell over. So that's hardwired. And if you caught things yesterday during my discussion on locators, it's sort of the same idea. I'm taking a hardwired path to verify or interact with something that may not work for you on a repeatable fashion. If for some reason my sort order changes, then this might break. If for some reason other records were injected in, if I'm not working with a pristine database, that location would change. The test would fail. So how can we make things a little more robust when we're dealing with tables? All right, first off, let me reload here. And also let me grab a quick drink. I didn't fix up my UI yesterday after altering things around to show the idea of locators. So in this example, I've got a baseline data set that we have loaded here. And I've got 4 records, and it's the same idea. Maybe I want to verify that my baseline data set is loading properly. I can do things positional, but that'll be a little hardwired. So the first thing is, let's take a look at just doing some recording around this, and we'll talk about some of the table-based features that you have in Test Studio. So I'm actually going to create a new project here. So what we're going to look at are ways to explore validating things more flexibly within a row, and also some of the features that you can get with some of the Telerik controls as well. So here we are, we've got this table loaded up, and now if I am taking a look at different areas here, you'll see that the highlighting looks a little differently. This is because this grid here is actually a Telerik grid, and because this is one of our tools, we've got some additional capabilities here. So I can change my scope between the data cell, data items for that entire row, the grid itself, or the grid view, or the outer grid as well. So if I take a look at the grid view, one of the items that I should have here is that we've got a data count. Now this is great if I'm doing something like I simply need to validate that a sort or a search is not a sort, but that a search might be returning the proper number of records from my baseline data set. And I know that searching for this term returns so many records, I can get a quick validation in here. So that's really handy. I can validate that I've got the right number of records. Now I could do something like validate that the first record might be my particular one. I can also just say in that particular data row, find me, just make sure that somewhere in there is the text Holmes. So this is still tied to the row. Let's be very clear. We're talking about the table row here. But if that row has this text in it, then we're good. We can also perhaps tie to an attribute and just make sure that the first row has that particular text in it as well. So this rad grid underscore ID here, this is a dynamically generated ID from the control. Certain controls may do this for you, certain controls may not. Regular HTML, of course, won't handle that for you. That's a benefit from the tools. Whoops. Oh, well, no, I don't want to continue. Okay, so this is an awesome feature which helps us make sure that we're actually doing proper validations, which I would have seen if I would have checked this. The problem is I edited what we were looking for and I left this as exact match. So obviously that's not going to work. Test Studio checks what you have on the page at the moment and validates your verification against that. So let's try this again. That passed. This one passes. All right. So we've got a couple different verifications built up here to start to validate that we've got the right number and that at least this name shows up in the first cell, anywhere in the first row. So it's making things a little more dynamic. I just want to check the first row, and somewhere in there should be that text. Now again, this isn't the most robust test, but we're starting to show a little more of the features that you may want to consider when you're working with tables. We'll rerun this. And all that passes. All right. There's a question about Test Studio interacting with Flash. Unfortunately, we don't support Flash. We'll work with Silverlight or any of the regular HTML, but we don't deal with Flash. Okay, so we've got the number. We've got a validation on that particular row, and we're also checking the ID of that row as well. Okay, but we can also do things a little more dynamically. Now here is Test Studio Express. This is our plugin for Visual Studio. You can write code in Test Studio standalone, but you can also do it by using our Visual Studio plugin. And this is great because now I can really start to do some very dynamic things here. So perhaps one of my test cases might be that I want to validate that I've got perhaps some business logic that's going on in one of my layers. I start out with a known data set, and I know that every time I load this screen, if all of my logic and my processing is correct, I should have two entries on the screen that show new Earth. So I want to validate that anywhere on here I can count and see that we've got a total of 2 records. And it doesn't matter where they are. Maybe the sort order's changed. We don't want to fool with that. So now we can use a coded step here. And oh, by the way, we're actually starting out with a test that looks very similar to what we had. You've got the same sort of user interface here, but I've got a coded step in there. Flip back to that. So what we're doing is we're actually pulling out that grid object. We're finding anywhere on the page that grid by its ID. So if I bounce back over here and I popped back open the DOM and I looked at the grid. So here's actually the grid control itself. You can see the ID is set there. So that's set in the code for that particular item. So I just want to find that grid. Then next, anywhere in that grid, find me all of the items that contain new Earth. Then I've got just a plain old simple assert from our test framework that says make sure that we've got a count of 2 for that particular result set. So we find the grid, we query the grid and find all of the elements in there that have new Earth in it, and we just assert that we've got 2 of them. And here I was just playing around with seeing whether or not I could bring NUnit in. So we'll go ahead and build this. And what have I goofed up here? Oh, wait a minute. I bet I opened this from the wrong location. Well, that certainly is a little foolish. Let me try reopening this, and we will get into that. All right. Ah, I had the wrong project opened. All right, so let's try this again. We'll bounce back into here. This is looking much better. All right, so now we'll go ahead and we'll run this test. Let's see, I've been using, we'll go ahead and we'll do things in Firefox here. All right, so this verify worked properly here. So that's showing us, again, find a grid, find the items in that grid that meet a particular condition, and then you can just assert. So this gives us a much more dynamic way to reach in and deal with things. We're not touching anything by position in that table, and that's critical if you're working with, you just want to understand, is a new record showing up somewhere on the table? Do it in this fashion. You might have also seen that that test popped open the edit for a particular user. So this is also another great way to deal with making things more robust. In this case, we're grabbing the same grid, and by the way, you may notice here that before I did it with a find, here I'm actually pulling out from our element repository. We store every page and element in a strongly typed hierarchy. So that's great. I can pull out strongly typed objects to deal with. So we've got the same idea here. Within that grid, find me a table row that contains Cobb anywhere in that. We're going to assert that we did get that row back, and now I want to click the edit link. So I take that row that we just found, and I'm going to search that again, and I want to find somewhere in there's an HTML anchor with a link of edit. And I just want to click that to open it up. I'm not actually doing any verification after that. This is kind of a cheesy test here. The point is to show you again, let's find a row anywhere in the table, and anywhere in that row, find me the edit cell and click on it. So this means that no matter where this particular row landed, we'd be able to find it. No matter where the edit link is within that row, if we added new columns, if we deleted columns, we'd still be able to work with that. So this is really crucial to thinking about how you're dealing with tables. Avoid hardwiring in your locators to those table elements when at all possible. It just doesn't make sense to wire that in and put yourself at risk. There's a question in the queue about how to find a value if it's if you're having to deal with pagination. So if we had, say, 300 records and it was scattered across 10 pages of different return results. If you are not testing specifically pagination, then don't deal with pagination. And what I mean by that is set up your system so that you know exactly what you can use every time to have a successful test. And if your test is simply, can I edit a user and update that user, then don't fool with pagination. Grab the first user every time. You could maybe extract out something like an ID value, edit that user, and save that user back. Don't worry about sorting through 6 pages of pagination and making your test hard. Deal with the simplest path. If you are checking pagination, you have to be very specific about what baseline data set you're dealing with. If you have those 300 records and you know that Bob Jones' record is always going to show up on page 5 and that's your test, then you load up that table, you click forward 5 times, and then verify that Bob Jones is in that area. Take pagination out of the equation whenever possible, unless it's specifically what you're trying to test. Okay. So, I've been running a bit long here with my examples. Spent quite a bit of time on dynamic content and tables, and then the bit about more robust tests there, meaning think carefully about how you're looking for content on a page. I've been showing coded examples and more flexible examples in Test Studio as well. I've been doing this through tables, but use that idea and that notion as you approach your tests period. If you don't have to hardwire something to a specific location, you're going to be much better off. If you have multiple widgets on a page, for example, figure out a more dynamic way to always look for the contents in widget 2 if that's your part of the test there. So one thing that I want to show is the idea of reusing functionality here. This can be a really powerful concept for you that can save you time and also help make your tests much more robust. And the idea here is over the long term. So if I have a test where I want to create a new contact, I have one test here I have to first log on to the system. I'm already logged on. I probably want to make sure that I logged on successfully, and then I might need to open up this form here. So I can create a number of tests that do each of those steps for me, and then string those pieces together to help me reduce the amount of work that I'm having to do in writing all of those tests. So for example, let's dive back to this. So in new contact, I have an existing test for saving a new contact actually shows the right results on the page. So this is a pretty simple test because this demo app is very simple, but this will show you the ideas that I'm talking about. So I've got a test here that I use every time first, and that is just simply that the new contact screen will open up properly. And if I dive into that, we can see that I'm actually first executing a test that says log me on. Then once I'm logged on, we'll click the new contact link, we connect to that window, and then we're verifying that the new contact form properly opened. So this is a child test to that other one. If anything about this changes, all I ever have to do is update this one test here. Likewise, here I'm referring back to another logon test that was already written. So let's dive into that. So now here's a logon test. We open up the page. We've got another subtest that says log me on, and then we validate that we're logged on. Moreover, I can dive into this log on if needed, and we can see here that I've got a simple little conditional that says if you're not logged on already, log on. If you are logged on, don't do anything. Conditionals in tests are generally a bad thing because you don't want multiple test cases or test conditions in one test. That's two different tests. But in these sorts of cases, this can help make your tests much, much more robust. So, I can insert existing tests in Test Studio, just like calling methods that I've written somewhere else. And I can simply do that by clicking this Test as Step, selecting a test here, and including it. So obviously this is in the bad spot. That's not going to work. But my point there was showing you can bring in any other test and reuse it. So the idea is to build up multiple little components that you piece together, and then anytime something about those components, either the UI changes or the workflow changes, you go to one spot, you update that one little piece, and every other test that references or brings in that piece of functionality will work again. Alright, so today we talked a lot about dynamic content. I showed you a number of different ways to deal with dynamic content. We moved into working with tables. And as part of working with the tables, my goal was to show you that sometimes diving down to code or looking more differently at how you're building up your verifications, you can build a lot more robust tests which aren't hardwired into specific locations on the screen. This is really critical if you have information that changes positions or that you're trying to deal with dynamic things that are coming back. And this will help your tests be much more stable and robust over time. Also, think about reusing test functionality. Don't write things multiple times. Write them once. Make sure that they're rock solid, and reuse those pieces throughout the rest of your tests. So that's my end of my presentation for today. I'm happy to answer some questions for a little while longer. We've got about 5 more minutes until noon Eastern, but I can certainly stick around a bit longer after that if folks have questions. So let me get a quick drink here to wet my throat again, and then I'll start working through the queue. And if you're not sticking around for Q&A, thank you very much for joining us. Please come back tomorrow. We will be covering some of the more advanced topics for setup and teardown. We'll be doing more encoded steps. We'll talk about data driving, and we'll talk a lot about baseline data sets, the importance of them, and we may even fool around a bit with some source control. So, give me a moment for a drink, and then I'll start working through the Q&A queue. Okay, there's a question about the differences between Test Studio Standalone, which is this version, and Test Studio Express, which is the Visual Studio plugin. Test Studio Express lets you maintain, record, and update tests. Now, we can play them back. I can do pretty much all of the single test functionality that I can over in Test Studio Standalone. The features that I don't get in Test Studio Express are some of the more advanced things from Test Studio. That would be things like performance testing, manual tests we can't do in Test Studio Express, and then anything around our load test functionality. All of that is available only in Test Studio Standalone, as well as making use of our native test lists or interacting with our scheduling server. So you can deal with test lists inside of Visual Studio through Visual Studio's test lists. So I can create new lists here. I can interact with things through this way. So that's some of the differences. The nice part about being inside of Visual Studio is that when I'm working in code, I have access to all of the other tools that I'm used to using, such as Just Code, some of the other unit test frameworks, and then all of the refactoring capability through there. So there's a question about closing pop-up windows. Normally that should be handled as part of the record and playback. And you can see back through here that we get, this is dealt with by looking at the URL of the pop-up window. So we'll connect to a pop-up window. We're already connected at this point, and then there should be another step about closing the pop-up window. If you're having issues with Test Studio not recording that and not closing it properly, please file a support ticket. That's a little difficult for me to troubleshoot in this media, meaning on this webinar. Our support folks can easily help you out with that specific information. There's a question about checkboxes being selected and not being, and intermittently being checked when playing back. This may be, so it's one of two things. Either the element locator is pointing to a hardwired location and you may be checking a box that's in a different area, or there may be some type of dynamic or asynchronous call going on where it takes a moment for that checkbox to appear. You could try putting a wait on that checkbox to appear and be active and then checking it. After that, double check how your find logic is to locate that checkbox. It's one of those two problems. If neither of those makes sense, please file a support ticket and we'd be happy to help you out with that. There's a question about the screencast videos. Unfortunately, they are not going to be posted live before tomorrow's session. I have a lot of moving parts with getting them uploaded, unfortunately. It's probably going to be more toward the end of the week before they get uploaded, so that's going to make things a little difficult and impossible to have them available for you before tomorrow. I'm sorry about that. It's just kind of the way my infrastructure works here from my remote office in Dayton. Yes, we'll be sharing the videos. Okay. Looks like we've got a few more questions that I'm working through here. Please do feel free to ask any more if you've got them. So there's a question about how to add coded steps to tests. Let me pop open one of my kind of scratch tests here. So from any test, I can simply select script step. The first time that I drop something in, it'll ask me, do I want C# or Visual Basic? Once that's done, then now I have a coded step that I have available here where I can write any .NET code that I need to. We do have access to things like IntelliSense. Well, I don't have the... okay. Sometimes I run into keyboard shortcut problems because I'm on my Macintosh. So this is full... this is a full coding window here. We'll give you IntelliSense pop-up hints on objects. You don't get the full Visual Studio editing experience, obviously, but that's how you add a coded step within Test Studio Standalone. Within Test Studio, inside of Visual Studio, then I can come over here, add coded step, and that'll drop a new step in there. So there's a question about viewing the viewing a class. Let me go to a better example here. What's a good one? Okay, so here's a good one. If I view the class, it will give me access to the full class that is the corresponding C# class code behind this particular test. If I have a code-only class, then we don't have any additional steps there. So it's a matter of toggling between the view class to show items which are code only for this, and then we don't convert, when you view class, we don't convert all of these to code. We only explicitly change to code things that you specify through this option here. So we'll leave things in the Telerik Test Studio format here until you convert them or add coded steps in. Okay, well, I think we've worked through all of the open questions. Thanks very much for attending today's webinar. There's my contact information again. Don't hesitate to drop me a line if you have some questions. And I hope to see you at tomorrow's session. Thanks very much for attending today. Bye-bye.